Good afternoon, everyone. Happy new month. Trust the first day of the new month is going well for you so far. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join the launch of the Country Climate and Development Report by the World Bank in partnership with the Presidential Climate Commission here in South Africa. My name is Fifi Peters. Extremely delighted to be spending the next 2 hours with you in your virtual room. I think we do know that November is expected to be quite a really busy and buzzing period for climate conversations in the build-up to COP27 later on in the month. But to not make this session about just paying lip service to climate conversations, I'm looking forward to hearing the detail that does lie in the report, particularly as it does pertain to a country like South Africa, the most unequal society in the world. What a position and a path to net zero does look like for a country like ours. We know that it will entail a move away from coal right now, a contentious issue, just given the fact that the sector does employ tens of thousands of people, and also the fact that quite a number of families rely on it. And so determining a framework, a successful framework that is a win-win for all is going to be quite an interesting and balancing act, which we'll be hearing more about within the next 2 hours. We'll be hearing from representatives of government, representatives of business, and also civil society as they weigh in on the debate. I look forward to hearing from you as well, particularly those who have got vested interests in the debate. Do feel free to share any questions, any comments, any ideas you have with us in the chat function. With that said, I'd like to introduce the very first speaker for today's session from government to share some introductory remarks, set the picture and the framework as to what the context in South Africa looks like right now, and government's thinking ahead of COP 2017. Ladies and gentlemen, introducing you to the Deputy General of National Treasury, Mr. Ishmael Mamoniat, who will share a few introductory remarks. DG, thanks so much for your time. I'm handing over the virtual floor to you, sir.
No, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I think, and I say thank you for inviting me because I'm proud to be associated with this initiative. I think, as we all know, it's become a cliche. Climate change is the biggest threat or risk that humankind faces. And I think getting a path through this, as we see with the coming COP, all the discussions that, these are difficult issues. And I think, as the minister has also pointed out, that when most of your coal-fired power plants are in one province, I think 12 or 13, and your coal mines, that the impact of moving away from the use of fossil fuels will clearly, if nothing else is done, create problems in that region.
Oh, it seems like we are having a bit of a technical delay from the DG. DG, you still there? We lost you there for a sec. You buffered a bit.
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
I can. Sorry to interrupt. Please go on, sir.
No, that's fine. And thanks for telling me. I was just saying that, just given the impact as we move towards a reduction in fossil fuel use on particular regions, for example, in South Africa, in the Mpumalanga province, as an example, I think brings to the fore the challenges we face, not just in South Africa, but all over the world, that there are developmental issues that we have to take up in the transition, and that we need to get through. I don't think many of us who might be informed by the science know that we have to get there, but it's going to be very important that we carry our communities, that we carry our country with us we should have no doubt after what we've seen with COVID, that when we as human beings face a difficult challenge, that you're going to get even a big proportion of the population that will actually deny that there's a problem. People denied there was COVID. People denied that there's climate change. And how you win over people so that ultimately they understand what the science is telling us, what we need to do, and win them over and make sure that the burden of the transition is not just placed on poor and working households is going to be critical. If we don't do that, I think we're going to find that politics is becoming more toxic, as we can see, and the world more divided, and we will fail to deal with the threat of climate change. And it's in that respect that I think this country climate and development report done on South Africa by the World Bank, I think offers us a huge resource to have evidence-based discussions, because I think it flags very clearly the context that we face in South Africa as we make this transition of being a highly unequal society, that as we move from mitigation to adaptation, what the real costs are. I mean, they've been put at over 2 trillion for just the next 30 years, rands, that this is going to require a massive policy changes, deep discussions on how we make the policy choices that we have to make. How do we meet our commitments that we made at the COP forum and at the coming COP27? And in a sense, as the chapter ends, or in chapter 6, making it all happen. I think that's the challenge we face. So I want to say that, I think that this document that's been produced, this resource, I think we need to make sure that we not just circulate it widely, but actually ensure that we have discussions so that at every level, in almost every department, in every municipality, in every business, in every organization in the country, and that people understand the trade-offs to be made and how we're negotiating this course towards achieving our commitments, our NDC commitments, and making a difference in the fight against climate change. So I want to thank, I think, the team, the World Bank team that has been behind this project. We've worked very well with them. I think the challenge now is going to be, how does this also fit into the discussions on South Africa's National Development Plan? How do we, over the next few years, as we look at the budget process, how it gives effect to this long-term transition? As you know, in South Africa, we have introduced a climate change. Yes, it is low and there's too many exemptions, but down the line, we're starting to outline a path, a steeper path for the carbon tax. We need to certainly deal with the exemptions. They're not all going to go away. We've tried to, but again, all of those are policy challenges that we face, and we need to get them harmonized within government and get this across society. I think I'll stop there. I've said more than enough, but I want to end with a note that we really welcome this report as a big step forward, I think, to take forward how we can actually make things happen and get into a low carbon growth path. Thank you.
Thank you so much, DG, for those introductory remarks. And I think that I agree with you in the statement that you have made about the importance that this report is circulated, because right now, climate change does, in part, sound like a rich man's problem, particularly if you're telling someone who is staying in the rural areas right now, who does not have access to clean water or doesn't even have access to reliable electricity, about the impacts of climate change. It does come across as though it's a theirs problem. But of course, what the report does show is that it is everyone's problem, and there are huge knock-on effects if the correct action is not taken right now with the speed of urgency that it does deserve. But to the point that the DG also made, there are trade-offs. And the balancing act is certainly going to be one, in my humble opinion, that will be quite difficult, however, perhaps not impossible to achieve. And so let's hear a little bit more from the World Bank's point of view right now, who are launching this country climate and development report for South Africa. I'd like to hand over the virtual floor right now to the country director for South Africa, Ms. Marie Kelly, to give us some high-level remarks, speak to the challenges, speak to the opportunities of this path of a transition to net zero, and also address some of the important facts we should know about the sense of urgency that is required right now. Marie, or MF, as I have learned your team calls you, ma'am, it is over to you.
Thank you very much, Pipi. And also thank you, DG, for setting the stage so nicely. First of all, good afternoon to everyone and a warm welcome, particularly to our panelists, but also to all participants that have joined us online. We are extremely delighted that you have joined us in the launch of this South Africa Country Climate and Development Report. Let me start by extending my thanks to the Presidential Climate Commission for not only having facilitated the coordination of this work with the South African stakeholders throughout the process, and particularly Executive Director Christian Olver and his team, and also for coordinating this event with us today. I'm going to build on what DG Momo has said to provide just a few elements on describing what this report is, and just give you a bit of the essence of the finding of the report, because the team will be presenting the report fully. So first of all, let me say that the CCDR, as we call it, it's a new diagnostic report that has been developed by the World Bank, you know, a little bit like this country economic memorandum that you are familiar with. And it is represented by the World Bank Group, IBRD, IFC, and MIGA, essentially to help countries integrate climate change and development consideration. So what it does, in fact, is to prioritize the most impactful actions that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and boost adaptation, while at the same time delivering on broader development goals. So they are built on data and rigorous research to identify what are the main pathways to reduce GHG emissions and climate vulnerabilities. They look at cost, they look at challenges, as well as benefits and opportunity for embracing climate agenda. So where are we today? At the World Bank, we have planned to deliver 25 reports over the next 4 years. And so far, we have delivered 11 of them. Let me mention in particular Turkey in Europe, and China and Vietnam in Asia. And for us here, the country climate report for South Africa is a third in our region, following the recent launch in Rwanda and Malawi just recently. So I would say that based on actually what DG has said, to reaffirm that the South Africa CCPR is quite unique from the others because it is embedded in South Africa knowledge, research, and dialogue. We have benefited from excellent work that has been done in South Africa on decarbonization and just transition. And this report has therefore benefited from extensive consultation with a number of stakeholders, the PCC itself, but also National Treasury, as DG just mentioned, and also academia, civil society, labor, and also our development partners, and this over about a 12-month period. So it was quite extensive in terms of timing and coverage. So it is again an opportunity for me to extend our utmost gratitude to all the institutions for the depth and the quality of the discussion that has contributed and informed this report. As Fifi mentioned, COP27 is in a few days in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, and I'm delighted to announce that the South Africa CCPR will be presented as part of a South Africa event in the South African Pavilion. And what we hope we at the World Bank is that this will continue to reinforce the visibility of South Africa, pioneering role in the global just transition movement, where we know international support is so required. So the report comes at a very timely moment for our view, from our point of view, given the importance and the urgency of the climate agenda in South Africa. In fact, I would like to acknowledge the important work that has already taken place in South Africa and the fact that, as Didi just mentioned, climate has been embedded in key strategic documents, and particularly an acknowledgement of the impact of climate on the low economic performance observed in recent years, but also the challenges of mitigation. We have also observed that flooding and drought are increasing in intensity and frequency. We had the recent event in Durban not too long ago, and this is affecting both urban centers and rural areas. Lastly, I believe that we are all aware of the energy crisis resulting from heavy reliance on an aging coal-fired power fleet, and that requires severe maintenance and renewal, if I can say. So let me end this part in recognizing important actions that the government has already taken. And in particular, I would like to mention the Just Transition Framework, as well as the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan that have been recently adopted by the Cabinet, as well as the Climate Change Bill that is currently under review by the National Assembly. Now, moving briefly to the findings of the report. Essentially, the main message of the report is that South Africa can achieve its development objectives of building an inclusive, resilient, and sustainable economy, while at the same time meeting its climate goal. But this requires taking appropriate actions on mitigation and adaptation measures with a particular focus on the people of South Africa, of their needs, particularly the poor people, which are the most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And this is very nicely articulated in the Just Transition Framework, and I suppose that most of the participants online have read it. If you have not, please do so. Secondly, the report stresses that while contributing to supporting the global climate agenda, it is foremost in the interest of South Africa to implement a Just Transition Framework. And on that, my colleague that will present the report shortly will elaborate a little bit more on this, so I will not go in detail now. So moving on, I would like also to remind ourselves that this climate agenda is a global agenda. So the report should be seen as one step, one element of a global and dynamic agenda that will evolve, that is evolving over time and in front of our eyes, if I can put it this way. It is a first analytical piece, and it proposes new areas for additional research that will inform in the future government decision. For example, and I'm not going to cite all of them, but let me cite one example. We believe that more should be done to better understand the impact of climate change on human capital, particularly on education and health, but also on housing and other private assets. So this is one example. You will see in the report there is reference to other important elements to be looked at. So I would like to close, Fifi, by reaffirming that as partners to South Africa, we at the World Bank see the climate agenda as a global public good And we are keen to support the government and the South African society at large in this important journey. I would like, maybe without further ado, allow to make the production team of the report that I would like to recognize and thank at the same time, to allow them to make a quick presentation so that we can have a productive discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, MF. Yeah, so bottom line, what you're saying is that this is a moving report as we move ahead in the journey. It's not it's a snapshot right now, and we'll be getting another snapshot when we meet the next stop sign or traffic lights or whatever it is. You have said that it ultimately is in South Africa's best interest to act and act with urgency, although it's in all our interests, really. It is a global agenda. And also, you've said something that I'm really interested to hear the next speaker talk about, the fact that as a country, we can achieve our climate objectives in a way that does not compromise the development agenda of inclusivity, of improving the poverty picture, the jobs picture in this country, and the inequality picture. So let's hear more about how the report says we can go about doing this. We're going to hear further key highlights and a lot more detail as to what the research did entail. I'd like to, at this point, introduce Mr. Jacques Morissette. He is the World Bank lead economist and also program leader for South Africa, who will be speaking to the report in more detail, giving us that presentation that we did hear we were going to get. So Jacques, good afternoon, sir. Over to you at the stage.
No. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can. Take it away.
Okay. So let me put the presentation on the screen. Fifi, a couple months ago, my daughter, my 18-year-old daughter, asked me, "What are you working on these days, Dad?" And I answered, "I'm trying to work on a report for South Africa, how the country can meet and reconcile its development and climate objectives." And actually, I was surprised. Normally, she's not so much interested in what I'm doing. And actually, suddenly she showed some interest in this report, and she said, "Dad, Jack, are you trying to find solutions to build resilience against flood?" And obviously, she had in mind the Durban tragedy a few months ago. And I said, yes, that's what we're trying to do all together with the government to try to find solutions. We're also trying to find solutions to end load sheddings and to provide more energy, more clean energy to the country. And eyes opened, and I was quite happy to see that she has some interest. And she said, but South Africa is a blessed country, actually. They had coal and they use coal, but they have wind, they have sun, they can use renewables. And I say, yes, you're right. On top of it, they have the most sophisticated capital markets and banks in the continent, so they should be able to finance those projects. They have businesses very well advanced, able to master the new technologies for moving to a low carbon economy. And I was saying that, and I look at her and she said, "Oh, Dad, so it's possible. It's possible for South Africa to meet its development and climate objectives." And actually, that's a key message of the CCDR. Yes, it is possible. So today I have not a very easy task because I've been asked to summarize the report in 20, 30 minutes, so it's not easy. So we decided to focus the presentation on 5 key messages, and so that's what I'm going to do. But before just presenting those messages, let me acknowledge the presence of my 2 co-authors, Bekele and Mariano. We have been working together. Actually, they're part of my family now because we have been working so well together. So that's one. But as well to recognize that this report is a fruit of a collective effort. Has been within the bank and not only in South Africa, but people in Washington, in Beijing, in Hanoi. So it's a worldwide effort, but as well with local and international experts. And I want to thank specifically two institutions. One is the President Climate Commission, which is here today with us. It's quite a tribute that they agreed to do it with us. So thanks again to them. And as well, I want to thank the research department of the University of Cape Town, because without them, without the knowledge that they developed over the last decade, I don't think we would have been able to master this report. So thanks a lot to the South African experts. So without further ado, let me go to the first message. The first message is exactly what I said before. South Africa can deliver an effective response to climate risk, undermining its long-term development objectives by embracing three interconnected transitions: low carbon, adaptation, and a just transition. Let me explain why we believe that South Africa can do it. And we believe because South Africa is facing three key challenges today. The first challenge, it's a weak economy lagging its peers over the past decade. I don't think I need to spend much time on it, but let me just illustrate with two graphs. The first one, since the early 2010s, the crisis 2008 and 9, South Africa has not been growing anymore. And actually, its income per capita has been contracting by about 5%. So you have the comparison with other countries, with other mid-income countries, and you can see that South Africa is unfortunately an outlier. South Africa is also an outlier because it is the most unequal country in the world. We can discuss the data, but the fact matter, South Africa is still a very unequal economy, a very unequal society. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge that we want to address in the report, it is a mitigation challenge. As you can see from this table, South Africa is one of the more carbon-intensive economy in the world. It is maybe not the most intensive, but it is one of the most intensive. It's 5 times more carbon intensive than OECD countries. It's almost twice as much carbon intensive than China, for example. This has huge implications. Of course, you have load shedding. Load shedding has averaged about 8 hours per day since the beginning of 2022, and we estimate that it costs the country about 200 millions per day. So it's a huge impact on the development part of the country. We know as well that the reliance on coal has environmental and health damages, and some estimates are that about 20,000 people are dying every year because of the consequences of air pollution. But you have also land and water pollution coming from the use of coal. Another negative impact of linked to the mitigation challenge and the dependence on coal is that the country is losing competitiveness. Since most of the export of South Africa to the rest of the world are based on coal-dependent products, and you have less demand for those products worldwide, and certainly we expect to have less demand over time, the competitiveness of the country is declining. So it is the second challenge. After the economic challenge, the mitigation challenge is the adaptation challenge. We call it the future is already the present for South Africa. And actually, I don't think I need to remind you that South Africa has suffered some big damages in the last few years. I'm sure everybody has still in mind the zero death in Cape Town a few years back, and of course the recurrence and extreme flooding in Durban. Unfortunately, those challenges, those climate risks are expected to increase over time. You can see that water stress is expected to increase exponentially over time, but as well major flooding risk. And you can see that the major flooding risk are quite concentrated in urban centers where people live and where businesses are located. So the impact for the country is likely to be huge if we remain in a status quo. So what can we do about it? And the CCDR argues that you can go from where South Africa is today with these triple challenges, economic, mitigation, and adaptation, to a more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient growth by adopting 3 transitions. The first one is the low carbon transitions. It's the low carbon paths where we assume that South Africa will gradually moving toward a net zero target by 2050. So the challenge here is to reduce carbon emissions over time. The second transition is adaptation and resilience. It's about building a resilient economy, and we will explain how to do it in a few minutes. And the last one, which is important for South Africa, is one of the specificities of the country. It has to be a just transition. If you're not able to have, you cannot afford to leave people behind the transitions. Otherwise, it would likely to backfire in an economy which is already fragilized by the huge level of inequality and poverty. So let me go to the second message where I'm going to build why these three interconnected transitions matters and how these three interconnected transitions will help the country to meet its development and climate targets. So let me go with the second message. While South Africa climate transitions will contribute to the global agenda, it is foremost in the country's self-interest to implement mitigation and adaptation measures with a sense of urgency. I want to emphasize two words: self-interest and sense of urgency. Let me elaborate on these two on this message. The first one is about the low carbon path. What we have developed in the report is that South Africa can move toward a net zero target, a net zero emissions target, when 2050. That can be done in a sequential way. The first sequence, the first phase, will be about the power sector. The objectives will be to reduce emissions in the power sectors. The second phase will be mostly about bringing transport, electronic vehicles, and to move toward low carbon transport sectors. And the third one will be to deal with how to abate industries like cement and aluminium and this kind of industries. So you see that the pattern will be in three phases. Let me focus on the first phase, which is mostly on the power sectors. We focus on the power sectors because if you're not able to move from a coal dependency to renewables and other sources of energy, it would be very difficult for South Africa to achieve the net zero target. So you will need to invest into renewables. The good news is that renewables are today the cheapest options to provide to increase supply of energy. So that's a good news. But obviously, it will be not enough to only to move into renewables. You will need as well to complement the move into renewables by the use of other sources. So we will see in the report that the gas can come to mind, the use of batteries, and eventually of other sources as well. You will, of course, to complement the use of more renewable energies with investment into transformation and distributions. And as well, and I think it is important in the short term to change behaviors by implementing some energy efficiency programs, because those are cheap and have immediate impact on the way people are consuming electricity. I said before that what is important is the self-interest, and moving into renewables and moving into low carbon source of energies is important for South Africa for three reasons. The first one, it is the least cost option, I mentioned it before, to end the load sheddings. If you want more electricity in the short term, if you want more electricity in the next few years, you will need to invest into renewables. The good news is that people are ready to invest into renewables. Already some businesses, and actually quite a few have already moved into renewables and solar and wind energy, but more can be done. The second one, and I mentioned it before, if you move into least carbon emissions sources of energy, you will improve the environment. You will improve as well the health conditions for the labor force and for the population, which actually will help you to grow faster. And as well, as I mentioned before, you will improve the country competitiveness over time. So let me go to the next slide, where we're showing that by adopting a low carbon path, so by implementing those changes into the power sector, but as well over time in the transport and in other industries, not only the country will be able to reduce emissions, but as well will be able to grow faster than it has been growing over the past decade. We assume that the country can grow by 2.3% per year between 22 and 2050 by adopting a low carbon path in the next 25 years. You will tell me 2.3 is still below the government objectives, which are about 5%, but I will tell you it is a double than the growth rate realized by South Africa in the past decade. And I will tell you as well that we can increase to 2.2% with the adoption of some structural policy, which I'm going to describe right now. Well, first, let me explain why you're going to have positive growth if you're going to adopt a net zero path. You're going to have a positive growth because of three channels. The first one, and I explained before, you will resolve your energy crisis by the fact that businesses and people will have access to electricity all the time. You will boost your economic growth. That will be the major impact. But a second impact is that you will increase labor productivity, not only because you will have a better allocation of resources because people will not be facing load shedding anymore, but as well you improve the health of the workforce, which will be multiplied on labor productivity and increase growth. The last impact will be through aggregate demand. If people have more income, they will demand more, and you will push, you will accelerate your economic growth. So that's a way. I'm not saying that's a solution for South Africa to jump to 5% growth, but it is a solution to have more growth that you had in the recent past. You can magnify this positive impact of growth if the country adopts some structural reforms. I mentioned here labor, and I will come back on it because it's an important channel. Of course, what is important as well is the use of the carbon tax. We're making the case in the report, and Mr. Momo alluded to it in his introduction. We believe that using a carbon tax is important for three different reasons. The first one, it is important because with a carbon tax, you're using the right prices. You will incentivize businesses and people to use less carbon products, which actually will help you to reduce emissions. It will help you to reduce emissions with less investment in technologies. So if you have less investment, you will have less crowding out of other productive investment and then less negative impact on growth. So you will magnify actually the impact on growth. And I will come back on it. If you use a carbon tax, you will be able to as well to finance part of the cost of the transitions, but I will come back a little bit on it later. So you got the message that if you adopt a low carbon path, you're able to promote growth, and beyond to improve growth, you're able to improve the health conditions of your environment and as well of the population. I mentioned as well that it's not only about mitigation. The country is exposed to climate risk, and I mentioned the examples of Durban and Cape Town a few minutes ago. Here you have a summary of different measures we're proposing the CCDR on water, agriculture, cities, and transport. You will see in the report we emphasize the urgency to implement measures, particularly on water and cities, because that's two of the main climate risks that the country is exposed to. I don't have to come back on it. I think it's pretty obvious. What I want to emphasize very quickly, that with many of these reforms, with many of these investments, you can kill two birds with one stone. You can first, if you move into cities, if you want to improve cities' resilience, most likely you will address water management challenges. So you can adopt some reforms which will address two of these challenges. As well, with some of the reforms, if you're thinking about land organizations or land management, you're able as well to address some of the mitigation issues and also some of the resident issues in cities. So think on reforms that you can have synergies and minimize the cost of investment for the most benefits for the country. Let me move to the third message. The climate transitions will create an opportunity to diversify the economy, but it will also significantly affect the global market. I want to start by emphasizing opportunities. A lot of the discussions about the climate agenda in South Africa and in around the world is about the cost of these transitions. Yes, and I will come back on it. You need to pay attention to this cost, but as well, the transitions will provide opportunities for South Africa. South Africa has huge comparative advantages on some of the sectors will be growing or expanding very fast in the next decades. There will be in huge demand because the transitions will not only occur in South Africa, but in the rest of the world. Let me just emphasize the first one, which is the non-mining sectors. You have quite a lot of minerals in South Africa, so except from coal, we will be in high demand in the future. If they're not in South Africa, they are in the neighboring countries where South Africa could help to transform those minerals and then to export them or use them for the transformation of some manufacturing activities. It's a huge opportunity for South Africa, but it's not the only one. As you can see here, we have been listed a few of them. So it's an opportunity for South Africa to find a drivers of growth of its industrial and manufacturing sectors in the years to come. It's also an opportunity to create jobs. So the labor market will be affected during the transition, particularly during the low carbon transition. We estimate that about 800,000 jobs will be created during the transitions, and they're coming from those sectors where we have found comparative advantage for South Africa. But at the same time, we estimate that about 300,000 jobs might be at risk because of the transitions. Those will be in the mining sectors, in the coal mining sectors. They will be in coal fire plants. They would be in some heavy industries. So if overall you will have more jobs, and we estimate that we're going to have twice as more jobs created and destroyed, you will have quite a few 100,000 jobs at risk and destroyed during the transitions that we will need to take care of. Another problem as well, and I want to illustrate it in this graph, is that not all the jobs will be created and destroyed at the same time. Most of the job will be destroyed in the 2030s, when the bulk of the jobs will be created in the 2040s. So you have a timing issues. Let me just go quickly. So I mentioned before that overall you have more jobs created than destroyed, but you're facing the country is facing three challenges. The first one is the timing challenge that I just mentioned. The jobs are not created at the same time. Actually, they're likely to be created after the destruction of jobs. The second challenge is location. Quite a few jobs will not be created in the same regions where jobs are destroyed. And the third one is the skill challenge. Some of the new jobs will require new skills. So that's where the government has a role to play. And I will go quickly about it. They need to ensure that the opportunities will be exploited, which means that they need to create a playing fields and improving the business environment to help particularly small and medium enterprises to expand and to take those opportunities, but as well to provide the skills to the labor by revisiting the education programs, the TVET, and so on, and as well to address some of the rigidities in the labor market today, because we know that in South Africa, mobility across sectors or across location is still facing some challenges. Not only the government will need to help to optimize the gains of the transition, but as well to take care and minimizing the losses. And here it becomes very important to work about the reconversions of the workers who will be losing jobs, as well to provide safety net, because not everybody will be able to find a job, and as well to concentrate, and I will come back quickly on it, on the Mpumalanga regions, because that's where most of the job will be lost. Let me go to the fourth challenge. Climate risk will affect all citizens, with disproportionately more poorest that must be at the center of the transitions. What Mpumalanga will require specific attention. So the first message is about that if you look in the main climate risk that South Africa is facing and will face in the next decades, they're mostly affecting regions where poor are located. You can see in the graph where we're showing by the circle that you have concentration of poverty, where most of the major risk states South Africa are. Some solution can be found, and you will find in the report that we're focusing on a few solutions. The first one is about prevention. The best way and the cheapest way, or the most cost-effective way to address climate risk and to protect the poor is about prevention. What's happened? So I'm talking, but so we're proposing three kind of solutions. The first one is about prevention. So you can help the poor by helping improving warning signals and I'm sorry, I'll be distracted, and making sure that the poor knows about the climate risk, and it's about education, it's about good communication systems. You can also improve prevention by providing the right infrastructures or the right services to the poor, and you can target specific areas and specific sectors to do it. But prevention will not be enough. Of course, as zero risk doesn't exist, and you will have as well to develop post disasters instruments. It could be safety net provided by the government, but as well some market instruments like insurance. So that's about how to reduce the risk of the poor affected by climate risk. We also in the report spend some time about the Mpumalanga region. As I mentioned before, about 80% of the coal-related activities are concentrated within 100 square kilometers in South Africa, within the Mpumalanga regions, and about 200 jobs at a risk to be lost, and actually likely to be lost in the years to come because of the incursion of mining plants and coal-fired plants over the next decade. It is important for the government to champion a just transition agenda in the province. It has to be done in coordination with all the stakeholders. He has to pay attention on providing a combination of financial assistance to these workers, to scaling up active labor programs to provide the skills and the ability to find other jobs. And as well, what is important as well is to promote the development of other activities by diversification, and as well by transferring some of the productive assets in the hand of the people affected by the transitions in the years to come. Let me go to the fifth and the last message: how to make it happen, mobilizing resources and institutional reforms to address implementation challenges. So as said before during the introductions, we believe that South Africa and most of the policymakers know what to do. There's not big discussions about it. I think most of the government strategies emphasize most of what we have been said so far in the CCDR. The question is how to make it happen. So how to make it happen? The first question is to finance these transitions. We know that those transitions actually will be beneficial to the country. They will increase the well-being of the country. Suddenly, you know you need to do it, but you cannot do it because you don't have the money today to do it. So it's a bit the constraint phase, but South Africa is how to find the money, how to find the resources to implement what needs to be done in the next few years. We estimate in the report that South Africa will need 8.5 trillion of rand from 22 to 2050 to finance the transitions. About 1/3 of this money will be needed before 2030. This is about 4.4% of GDP. Actually, it's a high number, but if you compare to other countries more affected by the climate change, I have in mind Bangladesh, I have in mind Vietnam. In Vietnam, the financing requirements are over 8% of GDP. But the challenge for South Africa is to find the saving capacity to mobilize those resources. And we know that the government is facing a huge fiscal constraint. And we know as well that the private sector, because of the lack of growth and the high unemployment rate, has a low saving capacity. So what can be done? We're proposing three different channels. The first one is to find the right instruments to shift private savings into renewables and other climate-related activities. You will find in the report that could be done by using the right prices, and I think the carbon tax is again something which could provide the right signals for the private sector to invest into renewables in other low carbon activities. But as well, you can have plenty of reforms in the financial sectors and in the capital markets. You can think about de-risking financial instruments, and you can think as well about partnership between different financiers. You can have partnership between public and private. You can have partnership between external investors and local investors to share the risk of investment in green investment. So that's certainly one of the most important channels to find the incentives for the private sectors to finance more green investment. The public sector as well will have to find resources to finance the transition. Here again, we go. One possibility would be to use the revenue, the carbon tax, which we estimate could provide an average over 1% of GDP to finance the transitions if it is applied without not necessarily a huge rate, but without exemptions. Because actually that's what we want, and that's what it should be about, to change the incentives and then to transfer some of the money to help finance the transitions and to address some of the social costs of the transitions I mentioned before. The government as well can improve the allocation of its own spending and direct them to more green activities. You can do it with policy changes. You can change the procurement rules. You can change as well as the transfers to SOEs, to state-owned enterprises, and to local governments by making them, by relating them to the performance-based indicators on environment and climate change. An important part, and it's not a particularity of South Africa, but it's a particularity of most of the African countries, is that you will need to use external resources. Climate change is not only the responsibility of developing countries, it is a global challenge. It's a public global challenge where many countries are the victim of the climate change. So, so certainly the need to find external finances. In the case of South Africa, as I just explained, it's not only fair, but it's also important because it will complement the domestic savings, which actually is somewhat missing in the country. Let me finish and most done is that it will be not enough to find the money. You will need as well, if you want to have efficient implementation of the three transitions that we have that I've explained today, you will need to have strong institutions. You will need to have strong governance, and it will be needed to address the political challenges that the country is facing today. I'm not going. I'm short of time, so let me just to highlight that there's a need to change or to strengthen the governance in many of the SOEs. SOEs are part of the solution and part of the problem of many of the climate change issues today in South Africa. So you need to address those governance challenges with a sense of urgency. We advocate as well that the climate change bill will need to be not only approved by the parliament, but as well implemented, because it provides guidance how to green fiscal and financial policies, actually to green policies in South Africa. So we believe it is an important bill. Improving coordination will be important because climate change is not the responsibility of one department or even from the central government versus municipalities or even of South Africa without taking care of the impact of climate change on neighboring countries. You need to improve coordination, and building capacity will be important as well, particularly at the local level, because some of the decision, some of the implementation will require some new skills. What is the conclusion? You will see that in this CDR, we're providing a vision where where South Africa can be 2050, and this vision is clearly a positive one, an optimistic one. But you will find in the CDR as well some five priority packages that the government, that the country should or could implement in the next few years. We believe that moving fast is important. Moving fast is important because the cost of inaction will be increasing over time. So more you wait, more it will be difficult and more it will be costly to address those challenges. We believe as well that if you move fast, if you move in the right directions, and you involve most of the stakeholders, I would say all of the stakeholders in the decisions and implementation process, you will demonstrate that everybody will be part of the process. That would be important because don't forget, you are in a society where you are one of the most unequal in the world, and to have this message where everybody is behind those transitions, it will be an important message to convey to everybody. So let me finish here, and I hope we're going to have a very fruitful conversation.
Thanks so much, Jacques. Yeah, I think we will have a fruitful conversation. In fact, the chat and the comments box has been quite buzzing as you have been delivering your presentation with the over 200 people or so that are on this call. So let's get to engaging further. At the stage, I'd like to invite our panelists to come and give us their views on what they have heard so far, and we'll also be taking some of the questions that we have seen coming through the chat. We thank you for your engagement, and you can continue asking away. So let me introduce you to the panel, beginning with Thuli Madonsela. She's the Law Trust Chair in Social Justice and a law professor at the University of Stellenbosch, where she does conduct and coordinate social justice research and teaches constitutional and administrative law. You'll also know that she is the former of South Africa post she occupied from 2009 until 2016. Advocate Madonsela, good afternoon to you, ma'am.
Afternoon,
Afternoon. Good to see you. Good to see you. It's been a long time. We also have Ms. Joanne Yawich. She's the CEO of the National Business Initiative. Prior to this, she was Deputy Director General for Climate Change in the Department of Environmental Affairs, responsible for environmental quality and protection. So quite vested interests in this subject. Good afternoon, Joanne. All right, as we wait for Joanne to come along, also introducing you to Michael Sachs. Hi, Joanne, you good?
Hi.
Perfect. We can hear you loud and clear. Michael Sachs, adjunct professor at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at the University of Wits. He leads the Center's Public Economy Project, a research program on fiscal policy and public finance, and he's also the former head of the Budget Office at National Treasury. How are you doing, Michael?
I'm very well. Hello, everybody.
Hi, thanks so much for joining us. Last but not least, Prabhat Upadhyaya, Senior Policy Analyst from the South Africa Climate Action Network, and he's currently leading a project studying the simultaneous realization of climate action and SDGs in South Africa. Prabhat, last but not least, good afternoon to you, sir.
Good afternoon. Glad to be here.
Wonderful. So let's get to engaging then. Addressing some of the issues raised by the report. Really interested in your comments and your insights here. And Joanne, just beginning with you, just given the fact that the private sector plays quite a big role in this space, both as an emitter of harmful carbon emissions, but also a potential solution provider to this transition to net zero that we are trying to achieve. Just your take on the role of the private sector, just how they can be further incentivized, if you will, to cut their emissions from here. What kind of changes, in your view, that would take?
Okay, so thanks very much, Fifi. And Afternoon to everybody, and thanks for the presentation on the CCDR. I think that it's a fabulous piece of work. And I think that along with a number of other big studies and big pieces of work that have been done, that we need to look very seriously at how we implement a number of the recommendations. So I think that the one thing that is important to say is that in the last couple of years, business in South Africa, in a piece of work led by my organization, the NBI, but supported by Business Unity South Africa and with technical support from the BCG, has looked at whether it is possible for South Africa to reach net zero by 2050. And in order to answer that question, we did a set of pathways for the key sectors of the South African economy, looking at net zero possibilities. And it's a very rigorous evidence-based piece of work. We relied to a significant degree on quite sophisticated energy modeling, but apart from that, from the expertise in business itself. And the overwhelming conclusion that we came to in this work is led by a group of around 30 CEOs, including most of the CEOs from the highest emitting companies in the economy, was that the pathway that South Africa needs to take is a pathway that really focuses on a renewables dominant energy system with some degree of peaking and balancing probably from gas or some other source to be able to do that with quite serious investment in storage as well. And that is fundamentally the direction that the economy should go in. Achieving that is a big ask, given where we are at the moment, given, I think, our capacity as a country to implement. We do great plans, and we set ourselves very large targets, but our ability to make it happen on the ground, I think, is often deficient. So there's a lot of work to be done to implement. But I think that our conclusion is that in a carbon-constrained world, importantly, and as a small and open and not particularly competitive economy, that the longer we delay in making the transition, the worse off business in South Africa is going to be. And so having defined the pathways, the question is, how do we get onto that route and what kind of capacity and support is going to actually be needed to make it happen? But I don't think that there is any question from business at all that this is the direction that we need to take.
Yes, thanks so much. And I think I'd add to that, what kind of support is going to be necessary to make that happen in a way that doesn't leave anyone behind? Because as we did see from Jacques in his slide, that we are the most unequal society in the world by leaps and bounds. And therefore, Professor Madonsela, ma'am, just your take here. Given the very skewed quality picture here in South Africa, what in your view needs to be implemented? What kind of institutional changes, any policy changes that perhaps can be implemented to ensure that as we move down this path, we do it in a society-wide approach that is truly inclusive? Ma'am, I believe you are still muted.
So, firstly, thank you, Pipi, and congratulations to the World Bank team working with the Presidency Commission for the report. By and large, some of the issues that need to be addressed to advance inclusiveness are already in the report. When it was introduced both by Mr. Morissette and MF, there was an indication that we're seeking a just transition that takes into account the fact that we are one of the largest emitters of carbon in the world. And At the same time, we are the most unequal society in the world. And therefore, we're trying to strike a balance between those two. What I would like to add from a South African point of view is that we also have a constitutional duty not to do anything that would exacerbate inequality. Linked to that is a constitutional duty to ensure that all policies that are taken by the government of South Africa advance equality. In other words, not only do we have a duty not to reduce inequality, not to reduce equality further, but we have a duty to advance equality. And a key case in this regard is Minister of Finance, Mrs. Van Heerden, but there are many others. So what does it mean then? The report correctly points out that we'll have to look at unemployment, poverty, and inequality. What I said to Parliament when I was asked to address on the just transition is that it's important that when we look at unemployment, we look at sustainable employment, because you may well get an investment that would look like it's going to advance employment temporarily, but it's not sustainable employment. I mean, if we're looking at South Africa 2050, we're also supposed to be looking at South Africa 2030, where we have an obligation to reduce inequality in terms of SDG 10 and also in terms of our own national development plan. So whatever we do here, we have to think in terms of systems thinking and say, as we solve one problem, we mustn't create another problem. So there's two issues of equality for me. It's around, yes, we have to create jobs, but we also have to make sure that the opportunity to create jobs is evenly distributed. In other words, we've got to use this opportunity to give an opportunity to new players to create jobs. But those new players should be drawn from places like Witbank or Imalahleni, because the report correctly points out that jobs are not always created in the same place. So you might have more jobs, new jobs, but they might go to an urban area whereas the coal mine was in a rural area, or vice versa. But there's another issue for me about the creation of jobs is when you take away a plant, you're not only taking away jobs at the plant, you're destroying or disrupting an ecosystem. So I would say the report is great, but from an implementation point of view, let's make sure that as we disrupt ecosystems, we rebuild those ecosystems. And then again, from another social justice point of view, women, let's not just see them as job consumers. Let's also see how women become part of the creators of jobs, not just lower end jobs where they're selling the products, the green products. Let's look at IPs, who gets the intellectual property, which takes me to my last point, ma'am, about let this not exacerbate inequality between South Africa and industrialized countries. Because again, we're always looking at creation of jobs, but we're not looking at who gets the IPs. And do we move into this transition in a manner that links us to be perpetually dependent on countries that are creating these green products? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. I mean, we saw the IP discussion heat up quite a bit throughout the pandemic. And I think that's important that you have foregrounded it right now as a future potential risk. But Michael, just sticking to the theme of jobs, the report did also show in terms of job losses and job creation that, you know, for every job that is lost, there's a potential of 2 to 3 to be created in the long term. But as Professor Madonsela has said, it's not necessarily the same kind of jobs, or the skills that would be needed for the new jobs might not be the skills that a person who's just lost their job has. And therefore, in your view, what kind of reform needs to take place? Something that's perhaps a charge is led by either the public sector or the private sector. to ensure that the situation of jobs and the disruption that will come to the labor market is minimized as much as possible?
Thanks, Fifi. Yeah, as I think Jacques Morisset made clear in his presentation, the report is a very useful framing of the debates around jobs and makes it clear that while the bank estimates that there will be net job gains, there are mismatches. And the statement that there will be net job gains is a contingent statement. It's not automatic. It depends on other things happening. So in terms of the mismatches, the report makes clear that the job losses will be concentrated spatially, will be amongst low-skilled and unskilled jobs, will be for low-skilled and unskilled occupations, and will likely happen now, up until the 2030s. The job gains are going to be spatially dispersed amongst skilled and semi-skilled occupations, and are likely to come later after the job losses. And I'm probably, the report is a bit less frank about it, I would say, but that's kind of the conundrum that it poses. And how do we answer that conundrum? How do we have a just jobs transition? Well, the answer given in the report is by and large two things. The first is the advice that I think the World Bank and others have been giving us for many years, which is about a flexible labor market. And I imagine that advice will be taken with a pinch of salt if you know about debates and the political economy of South African labor markets. The second piece of advice we're given in the report is that if we are to have a just jobs transition, we must invest in skills development. And the report kind of costs how much would it take to invest in these new skills. The problem is there that we can find the cost in terms of the fiscal cost of generating new skills. But demand does not create its own supply. And the problem we have in South Africa as far as our skill system is concerned is not one of an absence of resources. It's one of a failure of institutions. So we have significant resources devoted to post-school education, universities, skills training systems, but they are not delivering the results. So if we are going to have a just transition that does result in a net addition of South African jobs, we're going to have to put on the table a very serious reconsideration of our skills development system. That and it's not only a question of finding the money, but it's making the institutions work.
Yeah.
I have another point, Fifi, if you'll allow me.
Briefly.
So I think the other kind of immediate reform that the report is counseling us for, it says quite clearly that achieving this low carbon growth model requires the immediate implementation of a competitive wholesale market in energy with many sellers and many buyers, non-discriminatory access, transparent and fair rules, and incentives for capital to invest. There are three problems with this path. The first is political. Despite what it said, the report says South Africa has adopted this ambitious agenda, but it's by no means clear that the leadership of the country is committed to these market-based reforms in the energy supply sector and transmission and distribution for that matter. The second problem is that, as we learned after the collapse of the Soviet Union, effective markets require effective institutions. Markets can only be effective if they are embedded in an ecosystem of institutions. So all of these things about fair rules and non-discriminatory access are going to be difficult institutions to create. And as we have seen in South Africa for the last 10 or 20 years, creating institutions is not the same as passing laws or constitutions. So the work of so the transition depends on our ability to create effective institutions. The third problem with the market-based approach is that economics also teaches us that markets are an effective way of improving efficiencies, but they are not necessarily an effective way of creating equity. And I've seen in the chat the question, I think not raised sufficiently in the report, it is touched on in the report, but not sufficiently, is energy security. Are we going to have an equitable distribution of access to power once we have allowed these market solutions with many buyers and many sellers to take hold? Affluent households and the business sector will certainly benefit and probably provide more effective energy generation. But a just transition, I think we have to realize, is about more than the coal miners in Mpumalanga, and actually concerns many aspects of how South Africa structures its institutions in the period ahead.
Yeah, no, it's broad. I mean, extended to civil society. And for me, Michael, what stood out in the report, just in terms of some of the social security systems that could be implemented in the short term to soften the blow, I think it made reference to the social grants, particularly the special one that we have seen being introduced in the COVID-19 pandemic, perhaps being seen as a tool potentially to be used in this transition, and also leaning on other bodies like the Unemployment Insurance Fund potentially, but having all stakeholders at the table there, from the Department of Labor to the Social Security Department and the like. But the point you have made around equity is well noted, and I have seen it come through on the comments and the question section. We'll take it in just a moment, and perhaps Jacques can come back and address it for us. But Prabhat, just your initial take on everything that has been said so far, but I suppose more importantly, the reference to the recent flooding that did happen in KZN and in some parts of the Eastern Cape. What we did see, the destruction to people's homes and people's livelihoods, as well as the infrastructure in the area. Just, I'd like your thoughts and your take on the kind of protections that perhaps could be put in place, just given the fact that adverse weather events, I mean, it's not over. It's probably going to continue in the period ahead. Your take on the kind of social security measures that can be put in place to protect civil society a lot more when these adverse events do happen.
Thanks, Fifi. I think there are a couple of factors that we need to really take into cognizance, right? So firstly is this when we're talking of protecting the vulnerable part of our society, it's not just where we address them, right? It's elsewhere also. So it's not just in South African context, but in the international context also. So there's something which we need to do on the ground, but we also need to influence internationally also. So and then the second aspect is we have to factor in that the window for limiting the temperature rise to 1.5 C is actually closing rapidly, and for every 1 degree Celsius rise in the world, the Southern Africa increases by 2 degrees Celsius. So which means we are looking at 3 degrees Celsius temperature rise in South Africa. So we need to start thinking about a 3 degrees Celsius warmer world in South Africa by 2050, right? And when I talk of 2050, it's important to recognize that in South Africa's journey from post-apartheid to 2050, it's a total of 56 years, and we are bang in the middle of it. 2022 is 28 years after the apartheid and 28 years before the 2050, right? So it's important to recognize that, in spite of the best laid plans, we might not have a perfect society, right? So it's possible that we might have the best plan, and the point which Johan raised, the point which Michael raised, that institutions are important, the implementation is important, right? We can't just have a nice looking plan without really considering that, what is it that we need to implement on the ground. And I think that's part of the story. Even Thuli Marinzola also mentioned that, we create a lot of plans, policies, etc. But what is it, what's hindering the implementation? So I think that's where the skill set question goes into, that what do we need to do to enhance our institutional capacity, our human capacity, so that we can take on these challenges simultaneously. The report mentions 3 major transitions, right? Low carbon transition, resilient transition, just transition. These are not small, these are essentially societal changes, and 3 societal changes simultaneously, which will unroll in next 2 decades, 2.5 decades. So I think there's a domestic part of the story where we need to enhance institutional capacity beyond just coordination. So there was emphasis on the coordination, but just coordination is not sufficient, because a lot of the time our institutions and policymakers have institutional blockages, right? That limit that shift away from, or limit our imagination to see beyond fossil fuels, right? So to imagine a future without fossil fuel, it's hard, but I think we really need to do that if we really want to get there. So when we're talking of 3 degrees Celsius world, in real terms, it would mean a 0.23 meter rise in and around Cape Town, around Durban, right? Which is 23 centimeter rise by 2050, which would mean that Table Mountain wouldn't be renamed as Table Island, but it would be very much on the way to be Table Island by 2075. So that's the real term what we are talking about. And with that in mind, we really need to think about what do we need if we are getting into Table Island by 2075? What would it mean for Cape Flats? What would it mean for so many communities? So while these are very abstract questions, we also need to root them to the local realities and see what does it mean in real life? How is the life of day-to-day people live? So that's a domestic story. There's an international story also. So I would miss my duty if I don't flag that, we are running into the COP cycle in less than a week. And, addressing the vulnerability, it also is an international agenda. So we need to really emphasize the questions of how do we make the adaptation a priority? How do we make sure that the finance flows for adaptation, right? Right now, the adaptation doesn't flow. So we have a lot of discussion on our funding discussion on low carbon transition, just transition. But when we talk of resilient transition adaptation, there's hardly any financial flows going to what we really need to see. So that needs to be prioritized. Simultaneously, the loss and damage, because we really need to be aware that a certain degree of climate change is going to happen. And even though the narrative said that the poor countries will suffer the most, poor will suffer the most, the last 2 years have shown that even developed countries do not have capacity to face climate change. So that's what is at stake. So we really need to get serious about these issues. So there's these domestic, that what South Africa can do within South Africa and what South Africa needs to do beyond South Africa. And I think I'll leave with one last point. As in 2 years' time, South Africa will take on the chair of G20, right? In 2 years' time. So I think we need to be aware that in 2 years' time, we will be in a position, we will have a very important role in shaping what are the biggest emitters on the world and their agenda. So what can we do in the next 2 years so that we have the moral high ground in the next 2 years to really shape the G20 agenda, and that way we can impact the emissions and adaptation and the transition stories in a much more, at a scale, in a much more bigger manner. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
All right. No, thanks, Prabhat, raising really important future questions that we need to be asking ourselves, just given the positions that we will be occupying. So we have got a few questions that have come from the floor so far. And Joanne, just bringing it back to yourself, a question from Richard Worthington. And the question is, beyond this country report, are any participants looking at multilateral innovation for mobilizing finance, such as redesigning special drawing rights to channel finance according to the need and opportunity? So yeah, innovations to look at other forms of finance, given that we just heard that it's not going to be a cheap exercise. I mean, $8.5 trillion, wow. To do what needs to be done is a lot of money, and perhaps no single party can shoulder that financial burden alone. Just what do you make of what Richard's asking?
Okay, so I think that the first thing, and maybe I'm not going to answer this question from any particular business perspective, but I think that the question that Richard really is asking is about, firstly, about the international climate finance architecture. And I think that what he's actually saying is that it is inadequate, and I would certainly agree that it is inadequate, and that if we are serious globally and in the context of the UNFCCC negotiations around ensuring that the commitments that have been made around climate finance are actually provided, then there need to be a whole set of innovative and new financing mechanisms put in place, and they need to be financing mechanisms that are more and bigger than project-based finance. And in a sense, what we are saying is, if we're looking at a long-term and global transition, then the international financing architecture has got to be tweaked and fine-tuned and directed towards a global transition, and that requires serious money and serious mechanisms. I think the second thing, though, is that if you look at the work that has been done in our own country, I think there are three things that we need to be looking at. And I'm going to sort of draw on the experience of the conversation that we've had in the last year around this $8.5 billion offer that a set of developed countries have made to South Africa. And I think in reflecting on that, and in developing investment plans and the work that has been done around that and the consultation that has happened, firstly, what is clear is that as a country, we need to be looking at multiple sets of sources to finance this transition. I think our assessment, certainly from a business perspective, is that there is a very large part of what is required are things that certainly in a country with deep and liquid capital markets, you should be able to finance outside of the private sector. But there is also a big piece for the public sector, including about the way that we look at the fiscus and the way we look at budget. And a National Treasury has a climate budget tagging project underway. And the way that we start to mainstream climate into our budgeting systems so that we are, in fact, getting a whole of society response to it and looking at every level across the system at how does this expenditure ensure a positive climate outcome. So there's the public, there's the private, there is the international finance that we need to mobilize. And then I think that what we also need to be doing is to be looking in relation to the financing at addressing the equity issues. And it's come up a lot, but I also think that there is space in this to ensure that we are looking at a wide range of programs to be put in place that in the way that we invest to address the climate change challenges start to address issues of inequity. And I think that Michael referred to the fact that the risk that we run at the moment in South Africa without proper programs around looking at the equity side of things is you end up with a small group of rich people who have power and the rest of the country doesn't. And it's an unacceptable outcome to contemplate in any way. And then it requires us to be able to look at ways that both business and government and communities can put in place the programs, the mechanisms, the incentives, the systems that ensure that you also start to increase equity, you start to spread benefit, you start to cross-subsidize, you start to incentivize in different ways to what we've done before, in order that this is a transition that benefits everyone else. The last thing that I do think that is important to talk about, and it's come up in these questions, is that we don't have a choice as a country to say, let's remain a predominantly coal-powered country or not. there is a global shift that is underway. It is a long-term shift. We are looking at a process that I think is going to be undertaken over the next 30 or 40 years. We're looking at very rapid technological innovation in the energy and power space, as well as in the adaptation space. And we haven't benefited, we haven't, as South Africa, gone out and tried to systematically benefit from the adaptation innovations. But these changes are happening. So for example, I mean, we can't finance coal anymore very easily in this country. And part of it is because the Chinese government has stopped financing coal outside of China. And it has a massive impact on Africa. It's had big impact on our country and future coal projects that were planned. You can't get these investments anymore. There are changes that are happening around the world. And I think that what we've got to do, instead of saying, well, let's look at, coal has got certain benefits, I think we need to take on board the fact that shifts are going to happen whether we respond or not. Okay. And I think it is much better for us that we respond in a proactive and planned way to the extent that we can, rather than waiting for the consequences of things that we would rather not happen to happen, and then we sit with the problem. And I think the same goes for adaptation issues as well.
Okay, so let's flesh out then issues around equity and issues around coal in greater detail. And I'm going to invite at this stage Dr. Crispian Olfair from the Presidential Climate Commission. He's the Executive Director there, to tackle an important question around equity that has come from the group chat. And I'm going to read it directly from there. And it coming from Tabilioka. Hi, good to have you on the call, independent economist. And she's asking about the equitable nature of the transition, saying that there's no doubt that countries do need to reduce their emissions and move towards a more environmentally friendly energy source. But equity, to have countries that are the biggest polluters to reduce the most. South Africa is not amongst the top 10 of global emitters in the world. 20 countries contribute to 35% of all energy-related carbon dioxide and methane all around the world, and none of them being African. So, Crispian, in the sense, how do we define equity?
Good afternoon, Fifi, and thank you for the question. I thought Joanne had partly answered this. The issue of equity is not just a domestic issue. So it's not just about equity across the different income brackets of South Africa, but there's also an international dimension to equity. So there's a question of equity between countries as we grapple with this climate transition. And as the question points out, the obligation to meet the costs of this climate catastrophe that we are facing, that financing burden has to be borne in proportion to the historical emissions of all countries around the world. And that goes back to the start of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, the bulk of the climate budget, the carbon budget that we had available as the world, has been consumed by the development trajectory of Northern Hemisphere developed countries. And they bear the primary obligation, both to fund the costs of transition in developing countries and to compensate countries for loss and damage. So there's a clear global dimension to this issue. And this has been the subject of very confrontational, difficult negotiations at a whole succession of COPs. And you're going to see it play out again at COP27, because the developed world has, developed, I think, a very clear and well-articulated position around the compensation for loss and damage. You can already see, in terms of the posturing from developed countries, they're not going to sign up to it. They're not willing to even acknowledge the debt that they owe. And, just to contextualize it in terms of the $8.5 billion, this climate finance deal, I mean, yes, we need some international support. Yes, we'll work with the international partner group to structure a package that elevates our ambition as a country and helps us meet our development needs. But no, 8.5 billion is not the transition cost of South Africa, and it is not in any way a fulfillment of this global equity requirement that the developed North has.
Yeah. The cost runs into the trillions. We just heard. Yes. Jacques, just to bring you back, so for this in time, because there were some questions for you as you were delivering your presentation, just pertaining to the job losses, specifically in the automotive sector. I don't know if you are at the stage able to say, in terms of those job loss statistics, what is the projected job losses in the automotive sector?
Yeah, actually, we don't have this data. We did it not at this disaggregated level of the economy. We have the transport data, but we don't have specific data on that. But maybe on jobs, just a quick remark based on Michael comments. And actually, I totally agree. But it's more general comments that many of the issues that are related to institutions or structural reforms go much beyond the climate agenda or what is in the report. We agree that many of the political economic challenges, the changes or the reform institutions, making labor market more flexible, and so on and so forth, is something that has to be discussed. It's already been discussed in South Africa, and it's alluded in the report, but it's not the topic of the report. But of course, it has to be part of the conversation. So I just wanted to say that as well. Another remark as well that, and I don't know if everybody agree with me, but it's based on my experience in East Asia and as well some conversations maybe 10 years ago, which was between a chief economist of the World Bank and a Nobel Prize of Economics. And the debate was, what is more important, growth or distribution or equity? And at the end of the discussions, almost everybody agreed that first you need to have growth, and then you can speak about redistributions and equity. Maybe I'm wrong, but the experience in East Asia, which is a model of redistribution and equity, first you came by growth. And I come back to the specific point. For example, if you want to have energy supply, you need to have supply, and then you can distribute it. And I think redistribution is very important. So I'm not disagreeing with that. But if you don't have supply, how can you redistribute the supply if you don't have it? So I think one important message of the report is that you need to have investment into renewables. It could be from the private sector, it could be from the foreign sector, it could be from the public sectors, but you have to have an increase in supply. And then, yes, we need to make sure that everybody's getting access to electricity, which is, of course, very important. I don't know if I'm putting some fuel in the debate, but it's something that is very important and certainly goes much beyond this report.
All right.
One word quickly. I think that we will organize a series of conversation on that. This is the beginning, as Didi said. I think that both Joanne and Michael and Jack are right in some sense, and Prof as well, because as you promote this goal, you have to think early about it in the beginning to ensure that the distribution will come. We've seen a lot of growth without redistribution. So I think that we have to balance the comments. One of the authors of the report, Bekele, would like to say a word. Could you allow him to come? quickly? Please.
Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, Fifi. Maybe just 2 points that I wanted to highlight. One is already disagreeing with Jack on whether the redistribution should happen first or growth should happen first. But I think it needs to be contextualized, and especially in countries like South Africa, where history matters a lot. There needs to be that focus on broad-based growth, and that factor is hugely important. The second point that I wanted to mention is the question that you asked in terms of job loss in the auto industry. Yes, we do not have specific data, but I think there's an element of, there's a lot of work that has been done that we've built on for this report that estimates anywhere between 300 to 400 direct and indirect job losses in the auto industry. Thanks.
All right. A few other questions coming through. Michael, I think that perhaps this one could be suited for you. It's coming from Togozile Maronko. Yeah, be afraid, be very afraid. But what she's asking is, and perhaps also the other panel members feel free also to respond. The issue of growth and the degrowth of the circular economy. Any policy recommendations and suitability for South Africa's economy, just given the urgent need to decarbonize? I think in part that has been answered quite a bit already before, but I see that Professor Madonsela does have her hand up. Ma'am, maybe I'll throw that one to you.
Thank you. I apologize. I need to go to another meeting. Just firstly, I want to say to whoever designs policy, South Africa does not have an option to go for either growth or distribution. And certainly an option that says growth first and redistribution later is unconstitutional. Our constitution is very clear that we adopted to heal the divisions of the past and establish a new society that is based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. And Minister of Finance, Mrs. Van Heerden, very clearly says any policy that does not disrupt inequality and advance equality is unconstitutional. But I can give you many more cases that are aligned with that decision. That's just number one. But from an economic point of view, the growth and trickle-down economies approach that was made popular by Friedman, among others, has been discredited. There isn't an invisible economic hand that makes sure that when people accumulate out of greed, somehow they're going to redistribute. Then you could say you could redistribute through tax. That is too thin in a country like South Africa that was founded on inequality. And to the colleague that's suggesting redistribution, I suggest another economist who wrote a book called a book called Inequality from 1652 to 2002. That's a colleague here at Stellenbosch University, Professor Sambite Blanche. So that's another economist who just shows you you cannot in South Africa go for that model, even if it had not been discredited globally. Which takes me to my last comment. I really loved this report. You know, it might need a little bit of pen updating from an implementation point of view, but I agree with Joan that we don't have an option whether to do nothing or to do something on climate change. We have to do something. The second thing the report tells us is that those who suffer most from climate change are the very poor and marginalized communities. So if we don't do anything, obviously we leave them. So climate change is a matter of life and death. But also, according to Michael Marmot, who's written incredibly on health and inequality, he says social justice is also a matter of life and death. So we've got two issues of life and death. We just have to wear our innovative hats to reconcile these two. And I say when we're looking at the disruption that's going to happen, let's not just think of replacing the same jobs. Let's think about other ways. Let's say we're pulling out a coal mine. It doesn't mean that everyone else must now be employed in the green plant that we've started. We have disrupted a whole ecosystem there. We can think about what other industries do we build, or what other job creating opportunities do we give to people for them to survive. But I would agree with Michael, though, that we have to make sure that the timing, our management of that disruption, it is not in such a way that you destroy jobs today, even if you do it for a good reason, and then you show up 10 years later to address the inequality. In any event in South Africa, we don't have that opportunity. When Michael Mahmoud says social justice is a matter of life and death, in South Africa, not only did we see the floods that are linked to climate change, we also saw human disruption that is linked to social justice. And therefore, both social justice and climate justice are urgent matters for us in South Africa. Thank you.
Thanks, ma'am. Your point well noted. I mean, you can't separate the two. Essentially both intertwined is what you said. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate the fact that you did say that you had to go, and have a great afternoon further, Professor Thuli Madonsela. And just wrapping up the Q&A and the engagement from the audience, I know there's a whole host of question and answer taking place in the chat. It's great to see the questions being asked and also answered. Great exchange. But Prabhat, perhaps a final word from you to help us wrap up. It's a comment in agreement to a fund that you made, a comment that you made rather, regarding funding that is needed for adaptation, coming from Penelope Price, who says that, I mean, if we continue to have vague adaptation plans, such as build climate resilience into infrastructure, it makes it difficult to source funding. I think just going on to her question straight away, just how to better address this. How do we fund building resilience to climate change in a society? So the funding of building resilience. Any thoughts?
I think we have to recognize that ignoring adaptation is tantamount to having no life insurance, if I can sort of just summarize it in that way. So we are, without any, so we have a choice. We can survive without life insurance, it's fine, but it's advisable to invest in life insurance, right? Because you never know what may happen, so to say. So that's a very layman example. But the broader point is, we have made development gains in last 3 decades, right? But in last 2 years of COVID, a lot of those developmental gains have been eroded. Just in 2 years. Now, if you're thinking of climate change for next 2-3 decades, without any safety net, without any thought given to enhancing resilience, then we are essentially putting all our developmental gains up for grab. We are essentially playing Russian roulette there. That today it's flooding in KZN, tomorrow it might be elsewhere. Today it's drought in Northern Cape, tomorrow's elsewhere. So it's without significantly seriously thinking about resilience, not just resilience which we can anticipate, but creating space for events which we can't really anticipate, right? So what is also referred to as unknown unknowns, right? We don't know how climate change will impact various things. So one thing which we have learned from the Russia-Ukraine war is we do not know how these things have second order, third order impact. And similarly, we do not know if something happens in one part of the country, how is it going to have impacts elsewhere. So it's important that we start taking resilience and adaptation seriously, and not just as an immediate point. Yeah.
Sure. Prabhat, thanks so much for those thoughts. We'll leave it there. Thanks so much to the rest of the panel members as well. I know that time goes really quickly, but really appreciate your time. And that's Joanne Yawich, the CEO of the National Business Initiative, also Michael Sachs, professor there at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at the University of Wits. We've got two more elements coming up in the session before we wrap it up. Really quickly, just to get a perspective of the South Asia Sustainable Development picture and how it compares to the picture that has been presented for South Africa this afternoon. I'd like to introduce Mr. John Room. He is the Regional Director for the South Asia Sustainable Development at the World Bank. John, I believe it's your time now, so over to you.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Greetings from Dhaka in Bangladesh. Yesterday, we launched the equivalent report for Bangladesh, a couple of weeks ago for Nepal. Friday will be Pakistan's turn, and we started the concept note on India. I want to just go through very quickly 10 similarities and differences. Number one, the impact of climate change on development is here and now and huge in South Asia. It gets worse as climate change gets worse. And as we said before, the impact on the poor is much greater than on anybody else. And the areas of impact correlate very closely with where poor people live. So this is an absolutely common message. Some countries feel it worse than other countries. And the one recent piece that really sticks in the mind is it's not just the long-term climate change. The power of shocks, such as the floods we're dealing with in Pakistan right now, is huge. And when that hits, it reverberates for many years through an economy at a level that wasn't anticipated before. Second issue, we talk about a just transition, and often that just transition is framed around how we deal with people that might lose their jobs from the carbon economy. In South Asia, just transition is just as much about poor people and other vulnerable people that are going to be harmed by the impacts of climate change. And that's a central part to the just transition way it's being looked at in South Asia. If we look at the question of decarbonization, the South Asian countries that we've been looking at are fairly different. Nepal has an absolutely negligible impact on global emissions. India, much bigger, a little bit more like South Africa, where both decarbonization and adaptation are going to be central issues. But across all of these countries, it's clear that there's a huge number of things that can be prioritized where there is a synergy between development action and decarbonization, either through lower costs, better foreign exchange benefits, and in the case of South Asia, very much in terms of pollution, particularly air pollution, where there's a huge impact from carbon emissions. It's interesting comparing, and I'd like to see where we are in 6 months' time when we compare the decarbonization, particularly the exit from coal element or reduction from coal between India and South Africa. In many ways, the challenge in South Africa is not as acute as it is in other countries like India. As tough as it is, the age of the South African coal fleet makes it economically more important to make the switch, and the number of people impacted are relatively small. I'm not downplaying the importance and the difficulty of the issue in South Africa, but there are other difficult places to move forward. But it brings me to another advantage I think that South Africa has that comes very clearly through this report that's not so strong in other countries. And that is the strength of societal buy-in on a number of these issues. And where that buy-in doesn't fully exist yet, the strength of the open dialogue as evidenced by this discussion. So what strikes me is that there seems to be, through most commentators, a sense that net zero by the middle of the century is something South Africa has to do. How do you get there in a just way? And the fact that it has to be a just transition and that people are stepping into this debate into how do you make it is really a strong building point that a number of other countries do not yet have. In a number of other countries, they've got variants of the political economy and the differences of view, but there isn't the kind of forum or tradition that seems to have been established in South Africa over the years to address this. And so I think that's an opportunity that will move forward. Another core message that resonates in a number of these other countries is that there is generally a broad alignment and correlation between what is good for development and what is good for climate change. This message that it is possible to decarbonize and grow at the same time, to meet these decarbonization objectives, is generally true. Maybe for the last little bit of decarbonization to get net zero, there will be some bigger trade-offs in some countries, but the stuff that can be done in the next 10 or 20 years, strong degree of correlation. And clearly adaptation is very important for development. Development is very important for adaptation. A lot of discussion on opportunities from the low carbon economy, be it hydrogen, batteries, business economies. And here there's a commonality between India and South Africa. Given the sophistication of the rest of the economies, the relatively strong capital markets, relatively strong tradition of innovation, big markets need to move it. Hydrogen batteries and these sorts of things are great opportunities in these countries. But one thing to think about is that what South Africa is talking about and what India is talking about and what Chile is talking about to dominate the hydrogen market and to get benefits from it, a number of countries are doing that. And so it's going to end up being competitive between a number of people trying to move into the same space. Seventh comment is around large investment numbers. This large requirement for the transition has been noted by a number of people. It's very similar in a lot of the other countries. And as one of the speakers said, for more climate exposed countries, these numbers are bigger. For Bangladesh, for Pakistan, we're looking closer at 8, 9, 10% of GDP in terms of the investment. These numbers are huge. But to be honest, I don't know how robust the numbers are in South Africa, but for South Asia, a lot of these numbers and investment needs need to be further refined over time. But even having said that, it's a huge number relative to the amount of finance that's available. There is just a huge financing gap, and it's consistent across all of the countries that we're looking at. And there are consistent areas where action can be taken on this, and they're all pretty valid, very similar to what is talked about in South Africa. Increasing the amount of private finance, including through policy. Opportunities to do more, yes. Increasing public finance through repurposing, through carbon taxes. In some cases, there are opportunities to increase revenue, make different kinds of investment decisions, fairly common. And the need to raise international finance, all the arguments about the fact that developed countries cause this problem, and there's a moral imperative for them to finance this transition. And if they don't, and you don't get that international finance, the poverty impacts of climate change on these countries is going to be much worse. All valid comments, but if you add up what is likely to be feasible in the next 10 or 15 years and realistic in terms of that financing, in many of the South Asian countries, these numbers are still significantly lower than the investment needs that have been identified. Which means that even though there's a general correlation between climate action and development, in practice, when it comes to a finance-constrained world, trade-offs and phasing is going to have to be needed. And in many developing countries, they are going to have to make choices in terms of what gets done, where you build this resilience, how you do your human development. It's a very tough message. It comes back to say, push as hard as you can on raising the international finance that everybody's talked about. But countries are going to have to be realistic that maybe they need a plan B that requires further trade-offs in order to move forward. A lot of these reports focus on the longer term, and there's clear agreement on directions and policies of directions. But specifying what can be controlled in the short term is really important, and to nail down those recommendations. And this report from South Africa does a very good job in identifying those short-term actions. Which then brings me to my final quick comment, and that is it's about implementation. As much as there's agreement on longer-term direction, how these proposals get implemented is going to be critical. And so be that in the policy realm, how do you phase and implement and build public support for policies? On the investment side, How is the pipeline of investments built? How do you get shovel-ready products in order to move? How do you build the capacity? And many of the CCDRs talk about the importance of building institutions and capacity. But I think we need to realize this is a major, major challenge as goes forward. So one of the pieces that came up in the discussion here as well is the opportunity to socialize the recommendations in these reports. At least in South Asia, we're not seeing these recommendations as firm, absolute, this is what has to happen, but the basis for a socialization and discussion. And then finally, on this implementation, I think there's a lot of opportunity for learning between different countries. There's lots of things that are being done very well in South Africa and challenges South Africa has that are often matched by opportunities and challenges that are seen in other countries. I could go on forever, but let me leave it at that. Thank you very much.
I could listen forever, but unfortunately we have a limited time session. John, thanks so much for those insights. And you have left us at, I think, a very poignant part and point in terms of implementation. And Dr. Crispian Alpha, I look forward to hearing what you have to say as you wrap things up for us this afternoon. I mean, great ideas, great recommendations in the report, not without perhaps some gaps that have been flagged by some of the participants who have given us their honest feedback. But just as speaking on behalf of the Presidential Climate Commission, your thoughts on the report and your comments on implementation, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Fifi. And I mean, let me start by offering my congratulations to the World Bank team. And it was a very large team. And as was indicated earlier, complemented by a number of South Africans who've done an enormous amount of modeling work and policy analysis and pulling. You can see what a complex, wide-ranging report this is. So congratulations to the team on getting this done. It's a huge contribution to the debate. And what I'd like to do is just give you some reflections on the significance of the report. And you know, maybe the starting point is this climate and development nexus, because we've come out of a period in which climate has been very much viewed as an environmental issue and slightly disconnected from the main economic and development debates in the country, and at times presented in opposition. So, you know, you can either address climate change, or you can grow, or you can develop. And, you know, Thuli Madonsela earlier very eloquently, you know, emphasized that we can't be talking about one without the other. So we can't be talking about economic growth without fundamentally addressing the distribution of wealth and resources in society. And what this report says, and it's, you know, I think it's a really significant point that we mustn't lose sight of. It's saying that it is technically and financially feasible to achieve net zero by mid-century and to build our climate resilience at the same time as we boost the competitiveness and growth of our economy and create jobs and ensure a more equitable distribution of wealth in the country. And I think that's an enormously significant finding. And it complements very much our own thinking in the Presidential Climate Commission. So, you know, as I'm sure many of you know, we've earlier this year put out the Just Transition Framework, which spells out the different interventions that we need to take to make sure that this climate transition is just and equitable, and that it works for workers and communities that are going to be most impacted by the transition. And, that framework's been complemented in many ways by other core government policies. So, we built on the National Development Plan and some of the principles that were floated there around climate justice. The NBI, as Joanne mentioned earlier, did this net zero pathways work, which also, came to the same conclusion that we can get to net zero by mid-century in a way that, sustains the economy and doesn't damage jobs and growth. The NBI work, by the way, worked on a 10 gigaton carbon budget. I think this World Bank report has worked on a 9 gigaton budget. There obviously is quite a big difference between 9 and 10 gigatons. But we don't have to quibble about the size of the carbon budget. I think that's, in some respects, a debate that we still have to have as a country. And then you've seen these other very significant plans. I mean, the electricity emergency plan, the national infrastructure plan, which is out in phase 2 now, ESCOM's transmission development plan. So, the CCDR report is standing on all these other plans that are pointing us in a very similar direction. There might be some discrepancies in areas of emphasis. But all of them are saying that we need to massively invest in renewable energy. I mean, the NBI report was saying 7 to 8 gigawatts of renewable energy per year need to be brought onto the grid over the next 30 years. So it gives you a sense of the scale of investment that we need to be driving in renewable energy. Linked, of course, to the other areas that this CCDR report highlighted, the investment in batteries, the investment in green minerals, the long-term play around green hydrogen. These are all areas that are extremely hopeful. So, I think this report both complements what's on the table and it advances the debate in a very particular way. And for the first time, what we've got on the table is a comprehensive quantification of the investment requirement. And the numbers are big because, we're projecting it out to 2050. So we're thinking about, just under 30 years of investment, 8.5 trillion rand. Half of that going on mitigation and the bulk of that on the energy transition. So 4.2 trillion on mitigation, 2.2 trillion on adaptation. And I really like the way that this plan started to quantify the investments we've got to make in agriculture, in community resilience, in urban resilience, in the other infrastructure areas that we've got to upgrade. And then very importantly, at least 2 trillion rand on just transition interventions linked to reskilling, and not just reskilling, but the whole education pipeline and this higher education and skills development system, the investments we've got to make in economic diversification, the social support mechanisms that we've got to put in place to underpin workers and communities if we can't get them into immediate jobs in other areas. So I think the fact that we now have this is the benchmark. These are the numbers that we can now interrogate and which I think are going to very importantly inform debate for years to come as we look at the costs of this transition. There is, of course, another plan about to hit the public, and that's the JETP investment plan that Joanne and her team have been. And I said to Marie-Françoise when we met a couple of weeks ago, this CCDR is sort of standing, it's like a trilogy of reports. So you've got our Just Transition Framework that we released, you've got the CCDR, We're going to follow it up closely with the JETP investment plan. And I think it's building an incredibly articulate and impressive case for the direction that we have to take as a country moving forward. And it's given us a real platform to go into COP27 and argue a lot of these issues out there in the public. So thank you for that. Those are some closing reflections, Fifi, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Crispin. And yeah, we'll be watching the space, particularly those of us in the journalism and the media side for that JETP report. And thanks to everyone who has taken the time to come and hear the thoughts and the framework that has been outlined in the World Bank's Climate and Development Report. I think for me, my key takeaway is the emphasis that has been made throughout the session that achieving climate goals and development goals need not be one or the other. It's something that can be done together. I think I like the point that the report does make in terms of emphasizing the importance to mainstream this a lot more. So mainstreaming in business recovery decisions right now from the pandemic and the uncertainties that have been caused by the war, that achieving your climate goals as well as development goals can be done as one, and also mainstreaming this in government policy, particularly government policy that is structured around the recovery and reconstruction plan from the pandemic. With that said, once again, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. Have yourselves a great afternoon further, and looking forward to further engagements on climate matters this month as we head up to 27. Bye from me for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Okay, let me get